Sardinia is the second largest island in the Mediterranean. It's this beautiful island just north of Sicily, right off the coast there. Sardinia is not really known, I think, to the larger world outside of its fabled beaches. The Costa Smeralda, the Emerald Coast, of course, is really the jet set hotspot. It's a place where, of course, not only famous actors, but also people from the world of the Riviera have gone and made it their own. And most people, for the most part, go to Sardinia to their wonderful beaches, these places that are unspoiled, a true paradise that you really don't find in many other places in the Mediterranean today. And it took us 30 years to get there. I've lived off and on in Italy since 1989. My wife is from Umbria. We were based for many years in the northern city of Bologna. And we had traveled everywhere. We had done a lot of research in the north on the Slovene border. We'd been in Sicily. We had often taken boats to go to Greece or Yugoslavia. And we'd seen all of Italy, but for some reason, Sardinia remained over there. Somehow there's this strange sense of order in Italy that you must do Venice and Rome and Florence, and the famous cities, and walk yourself through as if other parts of the country are less important. And I began to realize, one of my last books was about the ancient Roman Empire and its own role with immigrants. And I began to realize, before ancient Rome, which defines so much of Italy, and Magna Graecia, the role of the ancient Greeks, there was the Etruscans, of course, that were in Tuscany that left behind these amazing tombs. But before them, there was an even greater civilization in Sardinia called the Nuragic civilization. That really was the cradle of the Bronze Age. And I began to look at the archaeological research that was exploding in the last 20 years. Thousands upon thousands of sites. Literally, the island is an entire museum itself. You have over 7,000 of what they call nuragis, which appear to be castles, but in fact are larger complexes that have many complicated aspects to them that dot the entire island from the north to the south, from the mountains up to the coast. And then we began to find this other archaeological treasury, the sculptures, some of the oldest colossal sculptures that you have in the Mediterranean, to incredible bronze work, which really served as vessels of stories, to more and more and more stories that started to come out that made me wonder, why don't we know about this ancient civilization? We do know about ancient Romans, ancient Greeks. We know about the Etruscans. Why aren't we going to the source? That in fact, perhaps in order to truly understand Italy, I first need to understand Sardinia. And therefore we went there and did our sabbatical, and we began this incredible 5-year journey to understand what Sardinia is all about. And it was, let me tell you, Jake, it was beyond any of my anticipation, because it's not just ancient history. Suddenly we're up to 4,000 years later, finding out that Sardinians today, through this incredible cultural revival, are continuing to shape Italy and Europe and the world today in so many different ways. I'm fascinated by the concept of islands now. And I think that's what really got us living in Sardinia is, what does it mean to be an islander? And so are you cut off or are you connected? And I think there's those two different kind of pillars. I think often those of us from the mainland see an island as cut off from the rest of the world. And part of my research in Sardinia was fascinating to see how so many travel writers for centuries, dating back to the 1600s, talked about how islanders were completely different than people who lived on the continent. And I began to realize, there's another perspective to that the islanders, didn't see the sea as a block, but as a channel to exchange. And in fact, they were the nexus of navigation. They were the nexus of trade. The first alphabet in the Western Europe, of course, was the Phoenicians there in Sardinia, who left behind the Norra stele, which is 3,000 years old. And this tradition of storytelling, of course, in Sardinia was incredible as islanders. The first woman to win the Nobel laureate from Italy was Grazia Deledda, who was an amazing writer from Sardinia. That the probably most important political theorist of last century was Antonio Gramsci, who really is still considered one of the great theorists on cultural theories and politics, especially for the left, of course. And he's someone who connected the island to the continent. That so much of being an islander was not to be isolated, as the stereotype is, but in fact, it was to be connected with the rest of the world. And we saw that in so many different ways. If anything, I see islanders almost as these vessels of stories that are then go out to the rest of the country, or the rest of the world. And I think that's what really inspired me about Sardinia, was to see this incredible treasury of literature that hadn't been translated, hadn't really been brought out to the rest of the world, and how that was very similar to Corsica or Cyprus or Crete and other islands in the Mediterranean.
So you feel like you'll continue to write about that terrain, that territory?
You know, I'm very interested in Cyprus. It's really, it's another island. It is, as the crow flies, it's quite near the Middle East, of course, but it's this island that is conflicted now. It's the only national capital that is divided between two countries, of course, because of an attempt of a coup in 1974 by the Greek Cypriots. The Turks invaded in 1974. The country was divided. It still has not been resolved. Nicosia, which is the capital, is a divided capital. And it's incredibly complicated but fascinating, a story of an island trying to understand its role in the world and being used as a pawn by other major players. I see a lot of Cyprus in Sardinia, you know, in that here's this ancient culture. The Cypriots and Sardinians were trading in the 15th century BC, you know, and so you find a lot of Sardinian ceramics and oils and wine and all these things in ancient Cypriot sites. And likewise with Crete, where you have the Minoan culture and other parts of the Mediterranean. And I think that's what fascinates me, is how we see the Mediterranean as this, you know, once again, I began my book in Sardinia by having a different map. There's a map that turns it by 90%. And so instead of seeing Europe on the top and Africa on the bottom, if we just shift that 90%, it's a very different concept. Suddenly, Sardinia and the islands are right there in the middle as really this central focus of exchange.